I want you to listen to this carefully, every single word. Because what you are about to hear is not ancient history, it is a mirror held directly against the moment you are living in right now. And when you are done, share this immediately with everyone you love who needs to see it. Their moment to act may be shorter than any of us realize. There is a calculation sitting inside the genealogical records of Genesis that theologians rarely perform publicly, not because the numbers are hidden, not because accessing them requires special scholarship or forbidden archives. The numbers are sitting openly in the text that billions of people have owned in their homes for centuries, but nobody told you to do the math. And when you finally do, when you lay those ages and names and genealogical records side by side with the precision the Hebrew scribes intended, what emerges is not the comfortable story you received in childhood. What emerges is the portrait of a world so systematically corrupted, so strategically dismantled from the inside out, that the only response available to the God who created it was to unmake it entirely, to reverse his own creation, to undo with water what he had ordered with words. You are above 40 years old. You have lived long enough to watch things change that you were told would never change. You have watched boundaries dissolve that previous generations considered permanent. You have felt the slow erosion of something you cannot always name but always feel when it goes missing. What you are about to encounter is not ancient history filed away in a museum. It is a mirror held up to the present moment with a precision that should stop every thinking person completely still. Here is what nobody calculated for you. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. These numbers are noted, appreciated briefly, and then filed away as interesting biblical trivia. But the implications of those numbers for the lived experience of every ordinary person in that world are catastrophic in ways that most Bible teaching never excavates. Take a violent, proud, ungovernable man, a man like Lamech, the great-great-great-grandson of Cain, who stood before his two wives and boasted in carefully constructed poetry about murdering a young man who had merely struck him. A man who declared his vengeance was 77 times greater than Cain's, not as a confession but as an achievement. A man who treated the capacity for violence as the primary measure of personal greatness. In our world, such a man terrorizes a region for 30 or 40 years before age, illness, or the violence of his own making brings him down. His reign ends, something shifts. A new generation inherits the landscape and at minimum has the theoretical possibility of ordering it differently. Now remove death from that equation entirely. That same man rules for 300 years, 500 years. He watches everyone who might have challenged him grow old and disappear into the ground while he remains unchanged in his strength and absolute in his authority. He watches their children disappear. He watches their grandchildren disappear. By the time the fourth generation of people who never knew a world before his rule are born, his dominance is not remembered as something that began at a particular moment. It simply always was. It is the permanent condition of reality, the natural order of things, the world as God apparently intended it. This is the first revelation that the antediluvian world demands from us. Evil without mortality does not simply persist, it compounds. It calcifies into the architecture of civilization itself until the people living inside it lose the very cognitive categories necessary to imagine something different. The horror of that world was not that extraordinary wickedness existed. It was that wickedness had been normalized across so many centuries that it had become invisible from the inside. Nobody called it darkness anymore because nobody remembered what light looked like. Genesis 4 records something that almost every reader passes over without stopping to feel its weight. Within the lineage of Cain, in the same generation, from the same father Lamech, came Jubal, the recorded inventor of all musical instruments, and Tubal-Cain, the first manufacturer of bronze and iron weapons in human history. Beauty and violence were not opposing forces in the antediluvian world. They were sister industries born from the same womb, funded by the same household, serving the same masters. Music was not created in that world to draw the human heart toward God. It was created in a household that had deliberately walked away from God's presence and built the first godless city. The gift of creativity, the capacity for beauty that God had woven into human nature as a bridge back to himself, was immediately redirected toward the service of a civilization that had made power its deity and pleasure its sacrament. This is a revelation with direct application to the world you are living in right now. When you understand that the entertainment industry and the weapons industry share the same ancient genealogy, when you understand that in the antediluvian world these were not separate spheres but deliberately interlocking systems that fed each other, you begin to see the present cultural moment with entirely different eyes. The numbing power of entertainment and the normalization of violence have always worked together. They worked together before the flood, and they are working together now. Now we arrive at the revelation that reframes everything. Go back to Genesis 3:15, the moment immediately after the fall. Before Adam and Eve took their first step outside the garden, God turned to the serpent and made a declaration that contained the entire blueprint of redemptive history in a single sentence. A seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. Not might crush it, not could potentially crush it under the right conditions, would crush it. A specific descendant born through a specific human lineage would deal a fatal and irreversible blow to the enemy of God and humanity. The enemy heard this promise spoken directly in his presence. He was standing in the garden when God said it. And from that moment forward, every strategic move he made in the antediluvian world must be understood through the lens of one singular objective: corrupt the human genome so completely that the promised seed cannot be born. Genesis 6:1-2 records that the sons of God, the Ben Elohim, a designation that appears in Job 1:6, Job 2:1, and Job 38:7 exclusively in reference to angelic beings standing before God, saw the daughters of men and took them. The word took in the Hebrew construction does not carry the language of courtship. It carries the language of acquisition. They identified what they wanted and they seized it. The same lawless spirit that animated every act of violence in the lineage of Cain had now found its fullest expression in supernatural beings who had abandoned their designed station entirely. Jude 1:6 records that these angels did not keep their proper dwelling and are now chained in eternal darkness awaiting judgment. God does not chain angels for ordinary transgressions. The imprisonment is permanent. The chains are eternal. What they did was so fundamentally violating of the architecture of creation that God's response was immediate incarceration with no possibility of reversal. But before the chains came, the damage was accomplished. The Nephilim existed, and what their existence represented strategically was the most sophisticated attack on the promise of Genesis 3:15 that the enemy could devise. If the entire human gene pool is corrupted, if every human being on earth carries non-human genetic material, then the Messiah cannot be born fully human as the covenant required. The serpent was not attacking humanity out of random malice. He was attempting to eliminate the biological possibility of his own defeat before it could arrive. Genesis 6:12 confirms the scope of what he nearly accomplished. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Not most flesh, not majority of flesh, all flesh. The corruption had reached a comprehensiveness that could only be explained by deliberate engineering rather than organic moral decay. And then Genesis 6:9 uses one word that changes the entire trajectory of human history. Describing Noah, the Hebrew text uses the word tamim, complete, whole, unblemished in his generations. Not just morally righteous, though that was part of it. Unblemished in his lineage, in his ancestry, in his genetic inheritance. Noah was not simply the last righteous man in a wicked world. He was the last genetically uncorrupted human being on earth at the precise moment when the enemy of God had come within one family of making the incarnation of the Messiah biologically impossible. The flood was not divine anger losing patience with bad behavior. The flood was surgical intervention to preserve the only remaining thread through which the promise of Eden could still be fulfilled. When you understand this, you understand that the cross is directly connected to the flood. Without the flood, there is no uncorrupted lineage. Without the uncorrupted lineage, there is no fully human Messiah. Without the fully human Messiah, there is no atonement that satisfies the requirements of the covenant. The flood waters that destroyed everything simultaneously preserved everything. The same judgment that erased the antediluvian world protected the single genetic thread that would eventually produce the one who would crush the serpent's head on a hill outside Jerusalem. Here is a revelation that will permanently alter how you read Genesis 5. Methuselah, the oldest human being in recorded history, 969 years on this earth. Grandfather of Noah, a man whose lifespan bridged more of the antediluvian world than any other figure in the genealogical record. Serious Hebrew linguistic scholars have studied the etymology of his name and identified a meaning that, if accurate, transforms every year of his recorded life into a theological statement of almost unbearable weight. His name means, when he dies, it shall be sent. When he dies, the judgment comes. If this interpretation is correct, and the textual evidence supports it with remarkable consistency, then Methuselah's life was not a biological accident. It was a prophetic declaration written into a human name by a father named Enoch, who Genesis 5:22 records walked with God and was taken by God without experiencing death. Enoch walked so closely with God that he received revelation about what was coming, and he encoded that revelation into the name of his son, sending a living prophecy into the world that would breathe and walk and age for 969 years as a visible embodied declaration of both the certainty of judgment and the extraordinary patience of the God who was willing to delay it for nearly a millennium. Every year Methuselah lived was another year the door remained open. Another year of grace extended to a world that was using that grace to accelerate its own corruption. 969 years of God refusing to act with finality while the name of his patience walked through the markets and streets of a civilization that had forgotten him entirely. And the year Methuselah died was the year the flood came. 2 Peter 3:9 says God is not slow concerning his promise, but is patient, not wishing that any should perish. That patience is not weakness. That patience is not confusion. That patience is a father who knows with absolute precision what is coming, possesses the power to send it at any moment he chooses, and waits because every single day of waiting is another day in which one more person might turn. But Methuselah died. The 969 years expired, and the patience that had endured longer than any modern nation has existed reached its terminal point with a quietness that the world around Noah completely failed to recognize as the most significant moment in 16 centuries of human history. When the waters receded and Noah stepped onto dry land, his first act was not to build a shelter. It was not to assess resources or establish boundaries or name anything after himself. His first act was to build an altar and offer a sacrifice. The first act of the new world was worship, the precise opposite of Cain's first act, which was to build a city named after his own son. Two men, two first acts, two civilizations built on completely different foundations. The contrast is not accidental. It is the text drawing a deliberate line between what human civilization looks like when it begins with God and what it looks like when it begins with self. And then God established a covenant and placed a sign in the sky that most people have fundamentally misunderstood for their entire lives. The Hebrew word for rainbow is keshet. It is the exact same word used throughout the Old Testament for a war bow. The weapon of judgment, the instrument of divine wrath aimed and drawn and ready to release. God did not hang a decorative symbol of peace in the sky after the flood. He hung his weapon in the heavens with the bow aimed upward toward himself. The images of God absorbing the trajectory of his own judgment. The covenant embedded in the rainbow is not simply a promise never to flood the earth again. It is a declaration that the next time the full weight of justice must fall on human sin, God himself will stand in the path of it and take it in his own body rather than allow it to fall on those who come to him. The rainbow is not a children's story symbol. It is a prophecy of the cross written in light across the sky. Every time you see it, you are seeing the promise that Calvary would keep. Every spectrum of color stretched across the heavens is God saying, the judgment is real, the debt is real, and I will pay it myself. Jesus stood on the Mount of Olives and was asked directly about the signs of his return. Of every epoch of human darkness available to him as a reference point, every collapsed civilization, every moment of divine judgment recorded in Scripture, he chose one with deliberate and specific intentionality. He chose Noah. Matthew 24:37 records his words with the precision of a legal citation. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, not similar to, not reminiscent of, as were. Structural correspondence, exact pattern repetition. The people in Noah's day were not destroyed because they were dramatically, theatrically wicked. They were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage. They were living ordinary lives inside a civilization that had normalized its own darkness so completely that the darkness had become the texture of everyday life. They were not choosing rebellion in any conscious, deliberate sense. They were simply not paying attention. They were living as though the warning did not apply to them personally, as though the door would remain open indefinitely, as though there would always be more time to reconsider. The word Jesus used to describe them was not wicked, it was unprepared. That distinction is the most important word in the entire prophetic passage for anyone alive today. Because unprepared does not describe dramatic apostasy, it describes ordinary distraction. It describes the quiet, daily, completely human choice to keep living as though the urgency does not apply, as though the door is theoretical rather than real, as though the moment of closing is always somewhere in the abstract future rather than approaching with the same silent certainty that the rain approached the world that laughed at Noah's hammer. Genesis 7:16 contains perhaps the most quietly devastating detail in the entire flood narrative. The Lord shut him in, not Noah, not his sons. God himself walked to the door of the ark and closed it from the outside, and embedded in that single action is a theological reality that should arrest every person reading these words completely. When God closes a door, there are no hinges on the inside. There is no handle accessible from within. There is no mechanism by which last-minute reconsideration, sincere regret, or desperate pleading can reverse what God has determined to be final. The people outside the ark when the rain began had access to 70 years of warning. The evidence was visible and specific and available every single morning. They were not destroyed because God withheld information. They were outside because they continuously chose to treat the warning as something addressable at a later, more convenient moment that never arrived. John 10:9 records the words of Jesus with a simplicity that contains the entire universe of human choice within it. I am the door, one entrance. One way through, that means the difference between everything and nothing when the water comes. The ark had a single door. Jesus is that door. And at this precise moment, as these words reach your eyes, that door remains open. The same God who encoded his patience into 969 years of a man's life, who waited 16 centuries before sending the flood, who is described in 2 Peter as not willing that any should perish, is waiting now with that same patience and that same love and that same absolute clarity about what is coming. But he is also the God who shut the door. He shut it quietly. He shut it finally. He shut it from the outside. And when he shut it, the laughter stopped. The mockery stopped. And for the first time in 16 centuries, the world fell into a silence it had never known. Because everything outside that door was already gone, and the only thing left was water and judgment and the sound of a family breathing in the darkness, preserved by grace they did not deserve inside a vessel they could never have built for themselves. That vessel is still available. That door is still open. Do not be standing outside it when God reaches for it again.